Hello and welcome to this video on how to apply for social housing. My name is Rowan.
And my name is Dada, and we are here today with our colleague David.
Hello, I'm David Thomas. I used to be a legal aid housing solicitor. Nowadays, I teach law at university and I do training.
Thanks, David. So this video provides an overview on how to apply for social housing. That is low-cost rented housing provided by housing associations or councils. The video is organised into 4 parts: understanding the housing allocation scheme, applying for council housing, navigating the bidding system, and challenging council's decisions.
The first thing to be aware of is that people without a long-term right to stay in this country are excluded from the housing allocation system and they cannot apply for social housing. Each council makes its own allocation scheme and they vary a lot. We shall mainly be focusing on rules and factors that apply to every scheme.
Let's start with a simple question. If I want to find a home through the council, how do I start?
Well, social services do provide accommodation for people who need care, that is, children and the elderly. But for everyone else, there are 2 different systems for getting somewhere to live from the council: the homelessness system and the allocation system. And they're quite separate. Though you may be dealing with both of them at the same time, they're separate departments and separate systems. So the first system is when you apply to the council because you're homeless or threatened with homelessness within 56 days. In this case, you'd apply to the department dealing with homelessness, often called these days housing options. They may help you find somewhere in the private sector, but if not, and if they have a duty to do so, they'll house you in emergency or temporary accommodation until you find somewhere more permanent. But even though you may be in temporary accommodation for a long time, this system can't provide you with somewhere permanent. We have videos which explain more about this system, which we're linked to below this one. The second system is what this video is about. It's also run by the housing department, and it's the housing allocation system. Every council has an allocation scheme. This is often known as the housing register or waiting list, or maybe by the name of your council's online portal. And although they look differently from council to council, there are some rules that apply across the board. This is a more long-term solution than the first system, because if you're successful in applying to it, you get a permanent place to stay in a council or a housing association home. This is the only way you can get a council home, and it's also the only way you can get the vast majority of housing association homes.
And how does these 2 systems work together? Can I apply to both systems at the same time?
Yep, well, it's important you understand the 2 systems are separate, but also in some cases you can and should apply for both. So if you are threatened with homelessness or actually homeless, you apply to the first system, but you should also apply to the second, because the second may be your best route out of temporary accommodation. And don't assume that just because you've applied to the council as homeless, that you are therefore put on the waiting list, you're therefore in the allocation system. You have to apply separately for that. And housing officers often don't tell you that. So there are far too many people in temporary accommodation who are not on the waiting list, but do it. Another way this happens, if you've made an application in the second system, the housing allocation system, and you're waiting for something to come up, and your home is seriously unsuitable for you, maybe it's seriously overcrowded or not suitable for your disability, it's possible to apply to the first system as well, on the grounds that you're not living somewhere where it's reasonable for you to go on living, so you count as homeless. Council may even encourage you to do so, but you need to think carefully before you take that step, and if possible to get some advice, because if you're not careful, you might wind up in temporary accommodation that's still not great, and having lost either your secure social housing or lost your priority in the bidding system. But on the other hand, you don't have to go through the first system to get to the second system. You can apply it to the housing allocation system, even if you're not threatened with homelessness, and many people do.
Okay, thanks, David. So who is the allocation system for, and who has priority?
So I guess the first thing to say is it's really difficult to get a home through allocation systems. There's a massive gap between supply and demand. An example would be that last year, only about 22% of households on waiting lists got a place. So the second thing to say is that every council has to draw up its own allocation scheme, and every council scheme is different. The scheme sets out the rules that the council applies in deciding who should get social housing in its area. The rules may differ from council to council, they will, but there are some things that will always be in an allocation scheme. There'll be a set of rules that say who qualifies to apply for the scheme in the first place, to be on the waiting list. Often you have to have been living in an area for 2 years, say, or 5 years, though that won't apply to everyone. You may be disqualified from applying if you've got your own home, or, for example, if in the past you've been involved with antisocial behaviour. Then after that, there'll be some rules to decide on priorities between people who are on the system. The council must give priority to some groups of people. They must give some priority to homeless people, to people in temporary accommodation, to people living in homes that are not suitable for them because of bad housing conditions or medical or welfare reasons, and to people who need to move to a particular area in order to avoid hardship to themselves or others. People connected to the armed forces also have a certain priority. Apart from that, councils have a lot of flexibility, and practically every allocation scheme will also provide for some discretion in exceptional cases. So there's some wriggle room.
What about if you're escaping domestic abuse in a different council area?
Well, in that case, the requirement for living in an area for a certain time won't apply.
So how do these priorities actually work in practice?
Again, each council works them out for themselves. A lot of councils use banding systems. So you might be in bands A, B, or C, for example, depending on your circumstances and your needs. So other councils use a point system, which achieves the same thing. Sometimes there's even a mixture of the two. As between people who've got the same level of priority, then practically always who's allocated a property will depend on how long you've been on the waiting list.
And how do I find out more about my council scheme?
You want to see your own council's allocation scheme. Search for that council's name and allocation scheme on Google. That's generally the easiest way to find it. You should find a long document, could be 50 or 100 pages long, which sets out all the rules for applying for social housing in that council's area, and how the council goes about deciding who gets it and when. If you're lucky, you'll also find a shorter summary.
So how do I get started?
First thing is to get on the housing register or the waiting list. Just make an application. You can maybe through your council's website, maybe there's a portal system that you need to apply to, or you could just ask the housing department how to do it. Once you're on the register, you'll get yourself a score or a band, depending on the system used by the council.
So once I have applied and I'm on the register, on the housing register, what happens next?
It's not compulsory, but the great majority of councils these days use bidding systems or choice-based letting systems, as they call them. for most of the homes they allocate. These are online systems which let you see newly available properties as they come up and allow you to bid for ones that suit you and your family's needs and preferences. And it's a great idea, in theory anyway. What would be ideal for you might be a nightmare for someone else. I had, for example, once I had an older client who needed a one-bedroom property. One came up that was a flat above a shop in a Victorian terrace in a busy shopping area. And for many people, it would have been absolute nightmare. But for him, it was ideal. He was really pleased with it. And that's a bidding system working the way it's supposed to. On the other hand, in practice, these systems have all the practical problems and glitches you'd expect from a complicated computer system run by a council. And different councils use different software programs. But there'll always be guidance on how it works, how to make your application. The software runs on rules set by the council, and those rules will be in the allocation scheme. So that's where you need to look if you think you're being treated unfairly. As an example of such a software program, below this video, you can find a link to tutorials on how to bid for homes using Home Connections, which is a software program that's used by quite a lot of councils.
So what should I keep in mind if I want to make a bid?
So it's really important only to bid for properties that you actually want. If you turn down a property that you've successfully bid for, then it's likely to have negative consequences. You might be stopped from bidding for a while or whatever. So you really need to do as much research as you can before you put your bid in. Look carefully at the information that's actually given. Are there stairs, internally or externally, that could be a problem? And there's often photos on the bidding system. At the very least, you can look up the property on Google Street View and see what it looks like from the outside and what the surrounding area is like. Make sure you can afford it. So rents that on properties that come up can be very, very different. So there's some rents on those allocation systems will be 80% of market rent, and some of them will be an awful lot less. So make sure you check into the rent, make sure you've got some idea of what the service charge might be, look at the council tax band. And one last thing, don't bid on a property as a stepping stone, bidding on a property that's not really suitable because it's better than where you are now, thinking you'll be able to get somewhere better that's all right later on down the line. As soon as you move into somewhere that's a bit better, it's likely your priorities will go way down. So it's much better to hang on until you can get somewhere you actually want.
Now, what if I find it hard to access computers?
So councils are supposed to help you with all of this if you've got difficulties with it. So sometimes they have offices set up where you can do your bidding and where their help might be available. Libraries are often very helpful. If you have a disability that makes it more difficult for you, there is a duty on the council to make reasonable adjustments to make sure that your disability doesn't get in your way. And these days, most bidding systems are set up so that you can operate them on a smartphone, so you don't necessarily need a computer of your own. And ultimately, as a last resort, if you, for whatever reason, you find it too difficult to bid, you can always ask the council to make a direct offer.
What is a direct offer? Not
all the social housing will go through the bidding system. Some of it will probably be offered to people directly. The allocation scheme will give details on when that's likely to happen and why. But an example might be if you've got a really high priority, but you're not bidding for whatever reason, the council might make you a direct offer. Sometimes you may want a direct offer and ask for one. In particular, if your home's really unsuitable because of a disability or something, a direct offer might be faster than waiting for somewhere proper to come up in the bidding system.
What can I do to improve my priority?
You need to look at the guidance and you need to look at the allocation scheme and decide what it is you're aiming for. So an example of what I mean is that some schemes have ways of getting extra priority that aren't obvious and that it won't necessarily tell you about. There was, for example, maybe a star system where people can get a bit of extra priority if they're good tenants, or if they've been volunteering, or if they have children going to school in the target area. If you know about a system like that, then you may be able to take advantage of it. If your priority, as it so often does, depends on health assessments, then again, it's just making sure you've got all the evidence you can in front of the council. Not just evidence about what your health condition is, but specifically about how that health condition impacts on your housing. So in other words, not just that you're unwell, but that because you're unwell, you have to move. So that's the kind of evidence you need to put in front of the council.
So what if I or a member of my family is disabled? Because I hear that there is a shortage of suitable properties.
I'm afraid that's true right across the country. There's not a lot to do about it, but one suggestion I have is you can bid for a property that you think could be adapted for you, even though it's not adapted now. And you could ask the council at the same time to do those adaptations. That might get you somewhere suitable. And if for whatever reason the council won't do the adaptations, then it shouldn't be that you should be able to say, okay, well, I won't take that place without it having any downsides. But that's one way in which you can increase the number of possible places to bid.
And what happens if I bid on something and then once I actually see it, I turn it down?
Well, as we've said already, that can have negative consequences. So you should make sure as far as you can before you bid that it's something you really want. The bad consequences vary between council and council. You might be stopped from bidding for a while. You might even lose some priority. If you feel that once you've viewed a place and it's been offered to you, you have to reject it, then the way you try and do that is you say to the council, it looks suitable, but now I've seen it. Clearly, it's not suitable for me and my needs. So please withdraw the offer so that I don't suffer any bad consequences. And that can work.
What if I'm already in social housing, but I need to transfer to another social home because my existing home has become unsuitable?
If you want to move within the same council area and the local council has a sensible allocation policy, it shouldn't be too difficult, because from the council's point of view, they allocate you a new policy, but they get your old one. So the total number of properties available remains the same. So, for example, you are not likely to have to pass a residency test in order to get a transfer. A couple of things to consider. Think about how your transfer is going to affect your security of tenure. Often the entry for a property on the bidding system will say this is an introductory tenancy, or if it's a housing association property, this is a starter tenancy. And it wouldn't be fair for that to apply to you because you're already a secure tenant in the social housing system. So you need to be aware that you should be able to argue that away. The other thing to think about is succession rights. In your existing tenancy, if you die, it may be that your family can succeed you. That may not be possible in the new tenancy. Just something you need to be aware of.
And what if I want to move to a smaller place?
Well, same applies, but even more so. Most councils are really keen to encourage this, as larger properties are generally the most in demand anyway, and the bedroom tax is a real issue for a lot of people. So there may well be special schemes in your council area for encouraging you to downsize in this way. It's worth checking out. In London, for example, there's the Seaside and Country Homes scheme for over 55-year-olds. That could be really good.
Are there any other options for moving to a different house?
Well, you can do a home swap. That's something you can do for yourselves, organise for yourself. They can be difficult if your own house is in bad condition, so you need to push your existing landlord to fix it up first. We've got a video that relates to persuading landlords to improve your housing conditions that's linked to below this one.
Now, I've heard of something called right to move. Might that be helpful?
So this is about an idea that you should be able to move between council areas for the sake of a new job or educational opportunity. Councils have to give reasonable preference to people who need to move to a particular area in order to avoid hardship to themselves or others. So if it's to take up work, any requirements to have lived in an area for years won't apply. You'll still have to show that you would otherwise suffer hardship. That is to say, you really need to move rather than just wanting to. So you just make the application to the allocation scheme of the council you want to move to.
So what do I do if I'm unhappy with my council's decision, like about what band I'm in, for example?
So first thing, probably going to be to try and find out exactly what happened. So it's good practice for your council to tell you about how they've reached your decision and to inform you of your right to request a review. But they don't actually have to do this unless you ask them. So if you're aware that something's happened, like you're being placed in a certain band, get in touch and ask them for the details of any decision that's been made. You could also sensibly ask the council for a copy of your file. Technically, what you're doing here is asking in writing for personal information, a subject access request under the Data Protection Act for your personal information held by the council. The Information Commissioner's Office has provided some guidance on how to do this, which is again linked to below the video. As a result of the request, most likely you'll just get a copy of your file, and that can be really useful in working out what's gone wrong, what's happened. You'll also, of course, need a copy of the current allocation scheme. We've talked about that already. So if the problem, a lot of problems are simply delays and failings to tell you what's happened, it can be useful in those circumstances to use the complaint system or to get an MP or especially your local councillor. If you've got a good local councillor, they can be a great help.
What is the review and when can I ask for it?
So reviews of decisions, it's much the same as in the homelessness system. Once you get your written decision, you have the right to ask the council to review it. And the actual procedures for the reviews will be set out in the allocation system and the allocation scheme. But very likely it'll give you 21 days to ask for a review. They'll then have 8 weeks to carry out the review. It'll be a more senior officer who does it. And it can be really useful to do it.
So is there anything that you can do if the review decision is against you?
You can apply to the ombudsman. So it's nearly always the local government ombudsman, though occasionally if you're applying for a transfer within the council's region and you haven't got one of the priority groups, then it's the housing ombudsman. But nearly always it'll be the local government ombudsman. So the ombudsman investigates the way the council has reached its decision and also whether it complies with the law. Again, there's a link below the video to their website, which is really helpful on how to apply. Also, get legal advice, always a good idea.
And what sort of arguments might work when I'm challenging decisions?
Well, okay, if the council's just got its facts wrong or hasn't taken into account something you've sent them, and that's fairly straightforward. Otherwise, have a look at the allocation scheme. I know they're long and complicated documents, but you only need the bit that applies to you. Have they followed their policy? Have they done what the scheme says? If not, that's a really good ground to argue. More generally, you may find there's a pattern of the council making decisions in a way that seems wrong, either because their own policy doesn't really agree with it or because it's discriminatory in some way. Basically, if it seems really wrong, outrageous, then it's probably illegal. It's community groups who are most likely to notice a pattern like that. And if you've got a pattern like that, that's the sort of thing that a solicitor should be really interested in challenging for you.
Thank you very much, David, for this really clear and informative overview of applying for social housing and challenging decisions. We have several other videos on different aspects of housing law and your rights in dealing with housing issues, so do check them out as well. And we've mentioned throughout this video several other resources that we've linked to below. Thank you very much, and I hope you found it helpful.